is Gina Duvernay, and I am the Adult Services Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library. Thank you so much for coming out. It's so good to see you all here tonight. And I'm so glad you all made it through all this traffic. So welcome, welcome. I want to just let you know, I know some of you have had some scrumptious cookies already, but it's those that don't know about them. They're in the back there. And of course, we have Paris Books selling copies of both our moderator and author of the night's book. So please, head that way if you have not already. What I'm going to do, we're going to get this started. I want to start by reading of the bios tonight. So Curtis Chin is the co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop and has written for both network and cable television. Chin has screened his films at over 600 venues in 16 countries. He has written for CNN, the Detroit Free Press, and the Emancipator Boston Globe. A graduate of the University of Michigan, Chin has received awards from ABC, Disney Television, New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and more. He is currently writing projects for PBS and Warner Brothers, and his essay in Bon Appetit was selected for Best Food Writing in America 2023. Now, moderating our talk for the evening is Natalie Kong, and she is a pioneer in the area of innovative leadership development and the founder and CEO, meaning Chief Eating Officer, of Global Earth, a multifaceted business that leverages the power of food and culture through its Cooking Up a Better World platform of inspiring, interactive, and impactful presentations, tours, and events. She has created an award-winning line of heritage recipe cooking sauces, earning her the title, The Sauce Maven. Kong is the author of the coffee table book, Egg Rolls and Sweet Tea. So let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all. Ni hao, y'all. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It is my pleasure and privilege. I'm so thrilled to have you here, Curtis. Welcome to my hometown of Atlanta, and thanks to everybody for all the hosts who organized this, and thank you for coming. So I feel like you were like a brother from another mother. Obviously, they picked me because I had, for those of us who've had some restaurant experience, working in a Chinese restaurant or growing up in a Chinese restaurant, I think there's a lot that resonated. But even for those that haven't, anyone who's maybe been subject to a racial slur or been confused or had questions around, race or class or sexuality and their identity, I think could identify with what you shared, which was billed as a memoir, but the reason I thought it was so touching and powerful is because there was so much more to it that we could take away from it. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more. We have a limited time tonight, so we want to make sure we have time for questions and some discussion and some reading from your book.
Sure.
Congratulations on the success.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you to the organizers, to Bonnie, to JT, to Gina, all the people that helped put together this amazing evening for me. As the title of my book implies, everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. I grew up in a Chinese restaurant. I like to think of it as not just any Chinese restaurant, though. I like to think of it as the Chinese restaurant in all of Detroit. The best. And the way I sort of gauge that is I always like to ask the audience to guess how many egg rolls we sold in the 60 years that we owned the business. So, you can't answer if you've read the book.
Yeah.
Okay.
How many? Let's throw some out there.
Any math majors?
It was open for 60 years?
It was open for 60 years, and we made everything. Even the skin was fresh. Like my grandmother made the crepe skin, and the sauce was made fresh too. Wow. 20 million? We sold 10 million. So, yeah, that's pretty good, right? My mom and my grandmother made them along with the people they hired to help them, like my aunts and stuff like that. So it was a really great restaurant to grow up in, although the area at that time was suffering through a lot of challenges. It was the 80s. Detroit had the auto industry that was going downhill. There was also crack cocaine, AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. But despite that, we had this really wonderful place where my parents could actually raise us, teach us the values and skills that we needed to go on with our lives. And so to me, this is more than just a memoir. As you say, it's also a thank you to my parents for providing us with that future, but also my hometown of Detroit, which I feel like oftentimes gets a really bad rap. But I wanted to show that there is this other side. Yes, we did have all these difficulties, but at the same time, it really was a wonderful childhood that I really wouldn't change with anybody else. And so what I want to do right now, before I read a longer section, is just read a little bit from the prologue, if we're good with that. Part of that, so the book is divided into 3 sections of 8 stories each, 888 for people that know Chinese. It's good luck. 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and then 8 in college. But I start off the prologue actually talking about my family's journey to the Midwest. And part of the reason I do that is, one, is that I don't think you can know a person's journey unless you know the family and where they came from. And the second thing is that I think that a lot of times when you read about Asian American history or literature, it's oftentimes centered on the West Coast or maybe New York or Boston or whatever. You don't really hear about it from areas like where I'm from, the Midwest, or maybe even from where you guys here in the South, right? And so I wanted to show that the Asian American experience is really quite more national, right, than that. And so I start off the book with the prologue. I'm going to just read the first page and then talk a little bit about my family's journey. So, again, everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain. That's how my dad greeted any new face who entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa Gong Li Chin had faced this same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young impoverished family. For here to go. For here to go. As I got older, it was a question I asked myself. Starting in our restaurant's long and open back kitchen, where my family made some of our most popular items, including the tangiest barbecue pork and best-smelling almond cookies, my mom taught me my first lessons. Before diving into math, English, and geography, she began with a little American history, tales of elders and ancestors, our family as prologue. And so the rest of the prologue continues on with that. We start off with Gong Li Chin, my great-great-grandfather, who moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there weren't actually Chinese people there. And then moving up to Detroit, he tried to get a job in the auto industry, had difficulties, so instead he did the high-hand laundry, which is what a lot of the early Chinese immigrants did. Eventually saved up enough to open up his own laundry, but then a grocery store. And then in 1940, he opened this place called Chung's Cantonese Cuisine, which is where I grew up. And it had instant success. It was a really, really popular restaurant, where really the whole city of Detroit came. And so it was a wonderful place growing up. The prologue sort of ends, in 67. At that time, the United States was going through a lot of difficulties with racial strife. Detroit got hit particularly hard. We had what was called the Detroit riots, or what some people can now call the Detroit Rebellion. And during that time period, my parents actually had to close the restaurant for the first time ever for 5 straight days. But in that time period, they managed to have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. And so sometimes people will ask me, why do you talk about racial justice and social equality so much? And I say, well, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around. So I owe it to them. But the rest of the book really addresses that fundamental question, is this for here to go? It's this idea of, like, do I stay with my family, this wonderful restaurant that I'm part of, my family, all the free food I could eat? But at the same time, the city around me is like falling apart, and I'm also questioning my own identity, how I fit in as a middle child, but also, being gay, right? How would that fit in with my family? And so that's the book. It was released in October 17th. Since then, I literally have done, I think, about 40 events, like all over the country. Like yesterday, I was in Cleveland. I did an event in Akron at lunch, and then I did an evening event in Cleveland. Then I got on a plane, flew here this morning. I'm doing this, and then I actually have to leave on a plane at 11 p.m. to fly to Miami to do an event tomorrow. That's just been my life for the last month. So
Thank you for
yes,
making
so I'm happy to be here. And we managed to squeeze in a fabulous dinner, thanks to Bonnie and Frank at the Chinese restaurant, Taste of China, just earlier before. So happy to be here.
So if you happen to fall asleep, we'll forgive you.
Food coma, yes.
Super. Well, like I said, it's much more than a memoir, right? And I think I'm speaking for many of us here when we say that there's so many things that resonated, I mean, you were able to, share through very personal stories and intensely personal, but the same time, you know, it's almost like a timeline of some pivotal Asian American events. I mean, literally, you know, the horrific hate crime events in Chin. We were there in Detroit. I remember reading about it, but you were there, and he was a member of the community. So many things are woven in there. I'm curious about kind of like what you were thinking in terms of feeling about like the timing of this sharing. Like this is your first book, but all of this was kind of going on in your life for so long, and I know you focused on kind of your younger years and through college. But you know, when you take a step back and actually write it, do you have any different feelings about it versus when you were experiencing it at the time? Because there was so much going on that you described. I mean, current events, personal, you know, aha moments, discoveries.
I mean, the difference between writing it 30, 40 years later and living it, I don't know if I can compare in that sense, but yeah, so this book has 24 stories in there, right, of growing up in Detroit, but there's actually another 20 that I wrote that didn't make it in the book, and I jokingly said to my agents, if this book does well, we can sell a second book called Leftovers. So I think the idea of like, you know, writing your life, you really don't know what are the important moments, right? Like, so for me, I started this project because my family had this long history in Michigan, but sadly, when my parents were in a car accident and my dad passed away, we all left, right? And when my siblings started having kids, I really thought it was sad that they would not know this long history that we had in the Midwest. And so I really started the project as a personal family thing. I didn't even think it was going to get published. That wasn't my goal. My goal was just to share our family history with my nieces and nephews. But then after doing it for a few years, I was like, wait, I'm spending a lot of time doing this. I should get paid, you know? And that's when I thought, like, okay, I've got to pursue what does it mean to get published. So it was a whole learning curve on that. But with that said, the way I started the project was I sent myself an email that said, everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. And I listed about 20 or 30 funny anecdotes that I remembered instantaneously as a kid. But truthfully, I think only about 10, 15% of that actually made it into the final book. Because there's a difference between what you want to write for yourself and who it's for versus what the publishing world wants and what the publishing world thinks readers are going to buy. So yeah.
Well, obviously your family plays a primary role in not only the book, but also, you're experiencing being an anchor. Right? Say a little bit more about that, whether it's a role they played throughout your childhood or, as you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in a big Chinese family, crazy Chinese family. In our house, we had like 2 parents, 2 grandparents, 5 siblings, and the occasional cousin, second cousin, and family of Vietnamese refugees that my dad took in. You know what I mean? Because my dad was really friendly. And the workers, whenever they would come in, like, yeah. So it was a really crazy household. And being a middle child, I really had to find my place in it. And that is one of the big struggles in the book, is like trying to figure out, well, where do I actually fit in to it? One of the big characters in this book is really my mom. So if it's okay, I'd like to read this story because I think it really does explain our family's experience, but also, my childhood growing up, because she was probably the most influential figure. So to sort of set up this scene, so one thing is that the chapters are all listed like a Chinese menu, so that's why they may not make sense if I tell you what chapter it is. So this is chapter M7, so it's like a Chinese menu. Okay, so to set up what was going on at this time, it was the 80s, being gay, it was a very terrible time period for our community. Really, the only thing that you heard about gay people was that they were getting this thing called AIDS and then dying, right? And a lot of them were really young people, plus all the death and destruction that I'd seen growing up in Detroit. I literally did not think I would live past the age of 30. I thought that, I'd have maybe a decade to live, after graduating high school. And so I didn't understand the idea of going to college and spending 4 more years in a classroom when I probably should be like enjoying myself and seeing the world as best I could. But my mom, who did not have a chance to finish high school, really wanted us to, and never really enjoyed being in a restaurant, really wanted us to go out and get an education because she felt like that would open up opportunities for us. And so I agreed to go by rationalizing that what would be giving up 4 years of my life versus a woman who's given up her entire life for me and my siblings. And so that's why I decided to apply. I did give the caveat that I would only apply to one school, and if I didn't get in, I wouldn't go. And unfortunately, the one I chose, I did get into. But it was a good school. It was Michigan. So for the Wolverines in the audience, I did have a good experience there. So I'm going to read this story. It's called M7 again. So. When I went to college, I wasn't sure what I was going to study. And so I sort of happenstance into creative writing because I was working full time and taking classes at night. And there are just a lot of writing classes at night. And so I also thought it'd be an easy A. So I was like, okay, I can write a few poems. So this is what happened after I got into this program at U of M. They only took 20 people in. So it was a really small, exclusive program. So chapter M7. Being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable as my dad asked every customer, "Have you met our number 3? He's the writer in the family." Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expected him to say I was the only one on campus even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance to have some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. "Have you read this book? It's so good." The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old, sassy Chinese ladies who like to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could have easily been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited the most memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, "You could be the next Amy Tan." My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I'd heard growing up, but now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing how our waiters sometimes pooled their tips together, my mom shared an oldie. "When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want to leave her big house, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me and my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made me watch as they forced my grandma to climb the old banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass." For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. "When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, a king's ransom in people's money, to local fishermen to ferry our remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The traitor had turned us into the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma." Another chapter came as we stood beneath a painting of the Chinese countryside. "When my pawpaw and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers." Once again, she gave me a demonstration, this time bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong after she was reunited with her parents and siblings were amusing. But these were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. I sat and listened, but that was as far as it would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns. I threw down my Parker pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. You've told me that story over and over, and I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke. My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. You don't want to hear my story? I tensed up. I do, but I'm behind on my own stuff. Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and Saving the World, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem. My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. Her 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Detroit and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, the ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. Go ahead, Mom. I'll write it down this time. My mom bowed her head as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. No, you go on. You do your own thing. I reached out my hand, but by then she had disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging woks and rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I had done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I had failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life. It was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right, but I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. So that's the story for my mom.
I have several of my favorite sections in the book, but I noted one, which I remember Elena Keegan in the Supreme Court hearings mentioned, and because I love the power of how food brings people together, right? And it can be, an instrument of inclusion without it being intentional. It's just a really good place, and your restaurant was one of those places. So this section that I want to mention to you and have you share a little bit more about is this part. Featuring Americanized versions of Cantonese dishes as well as new American fare like chop suey and egg foo young. This is on page 5 if anyone wants to follow. The menu appealed to Jewish customers who appreciated the absence of dairy ingredients. Mixing milk and meat isn't kosher, and the fact that we as fellow non-Christians were open on Christmas Day. Black customers who faced discrimination elsewhere could stay and enjoy dining room service. The white customers admired the exotic dishes that whisked them far from the grime and the sweat of the factory floor. Our cheap prices, that was for everyone. So the restaurant was a place that everyone could come together. It probably wasn't on any sign, it wasn't anything that was described, but I find it fascinating that that's a place, and throughout history, that has also been a place. During Reconstruction, the Chinese grocery stores were also a place where folks could come together. Share a little bit about that, and because we're in Atlanta and the black-white paradigm exists, in Detroit, similarly, you've mentioned a lot about kind of not fitting in or having to choose between black and white. Do you mind sharing a little bit more?
Yeah, Detroit was a very racially polarized city. Black and white. One of the most common phrases growing up was fight between a black and a white, right, on the school playground. And, being neither black and white, I knew instantly I had to pick a side, right? But I wanted to play with both sets of kids. And so I tried to be nice to both, but that was kind of like a problem because being Switzerland turned me into Swiss cheese. That's what I said, because these kids just would pick on me then. So the one thing that united the black and white kids was picking on the Chinese kid. So, but yeah, that whole dynamic, that balance of where do you quite fit in, because you're neither one or the other, right? It's just something I've always had to navigate. Yeah.
I found that some of the most insightful passages in here were in your uncertainty. And it's not like you had all the answers you couldn't have, right? But it was just the experience, the real experiences that you had, and the way that you were able to, the observation, the honesty, the openness, and the courage to just share honestly about it. I found the insightful nuggets actually in the fact that you weren't sure, right? Like you
Yeah.
had mentioned, well, I'm not sure about the clash between, the tension between maybe black customers and Asian customers, or would there seem to be a racist comment mentioned? You put it out there, but it's not like we had all the answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly at these age, I mean, you're confused by a lot and you're just trying to figure out your own world. I have to say, though, that when I first started writing the book, it really was just going to be those middle school years because, again, it was for my family. And it's easy to write goofy stories about your mean grandmother and your grandfather who ran the Chinese mafia in town, right? Those are easy stories to write. But the idea of like getting into your high school years and your college years where you're a little bit older and you actually are growing and you're changing was not something I was planning to do. I felt like, so what happened was that I was working on this book for a number of years, not having much traction, but then what happened was COVID. George Floyd was murdered. There was a rise in reporting of anti-Asian hate crimes. And I thought like, oh, well, maybe I can shift my book a little bit to talk about these things because I am a riot baby, after all. So, maybe I should talk about these ideas of intersectionality, racial identity, the coming out process. And as soon as I started talking about stuff like that or shifting the book, that's when, I had multiple offers from agents. The book sold in a giant auction in 3 weeks, between all the big publishers in a giant bidding war for it. And so, it became a much more difficult book to write, but in the end, maybe a more gratifying book because it resonated with more people, or maybe, or I don't know, maybe the publishing world likes to see people bleed, and so they want to hear the tough stories and things like that.
You mentioned open wounds.
Yeah.
Well, if it wasn't what you expected, I mean, I was just kind of empathic with you as I was reading it, saying, whoa. On the one hand, like, hey, did you read my diary? Because I was able to relate to a lot of it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, wow, some of it is really, it's painful, it's confusing, it's kind of a mishmash, and then,
Well, like I say in the beginning of the book, it's like I hope the book is like so the book is really structured like entering a Chinese restaurant. So like the opening line is like what you would encounter when you first enter a restaurant, for here to go. The last line is the last line of what you might encounter when you leave a restaurant. The whole idea of like all the stories is presented, not just the menu motif in it, but the idea of having like salty and savory stories, hot and spicy. Like there's all different tones in it, like all these different moments that you can share. Because I think that's what life is too, right? Like there's not all one, all happiness. It's not all sadness. That's what your childhood is, right? It's going to be a mix of all these different things. And so, the idea of being vulnerable and open, I think I just really tried to set myself in that moment and try to recall what that was like, whether it was the awkwardness or the excitement or whatever. And so I really was not thinking of, like who the audience would be, who would be reading it, who might judge me for these things. I just really tried to be in that moment. So
and it came out beautifully, because I think it's oftentimes when you're not thinking about an audience, you're not dancing for an audience, not writing for an audience, that the magic happens. And like you said, it's similar to our own family or our own history. It's imperfect, right? And it's the good, bad, and the ugly. You have to come face with, especially if you're not even expecting to share as much as you did. Let's tack on another. I mean, those are formative years.
The worst years. Yeah, the other thing too.
Without being gay, without being Asian American, without being all of that in Detroit, I mean, it's.
Yes, I was also a Republican back then.
That's right.
Yes. How many layers of craziness was going on there? Yeah, I was the Asian Alex P. Keaton, if that means anything to you all. I was like the class president in high school, president of the National Honor Society. I co-founded the Young Republican Club, Students Against Smoking. I was like a total terror.
Like, I'm going to have what you're having. So it must have been in the food. Curtis. It must have been.
No, I mean, it was this drive because, again, one of the stereotypes of Asian Americans is that we're not very loyal, right? We're not American or whatever. And so when we moved to this neighborhood that was 98% white, I was going to out-patriot all the white kids. I was going to be more American than they could ever be, and so that was part of it. That was my mask, that was my cover, right? But then through the journey of the book, you realize that, well, you have to be yourself, right? Like if you don't believe in certain things, you can't adopt them just because everybody else is, going along with it. And so part of that was going off to the University of Michigan, which is like this liberal bastion, and constantly getting picked on by all the liberal kids, and then finally deciding, okay, well, what do I really believe in? Like, what are my values, right? And then being open to change. I think that's the other lesson in the book too, right? Because I do hopefully grow. I'm a different person by the end from the beginning, including what my political values are too. So yeah.
And what would you say? I know that you can't pinpoint maybe one thing, one person, and we all aspire to grow and to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Some people never do, it seems.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit about what might have been a catalyst or a particular experience or person that might have helped you along in your journey of growth?
Are you talking about the Vincent Chin case? Or
No, nothing in particular. I'm just thinking, it's impressive that you were able to handle all of this stuff and seem to make sense and have an amazing story that resonates with many people. Can you point to?
Well, I feel like that would be the Vincent Chin story, because prior to that, I literally thought I would just work in my family's business. I was just going to inherit the restaurant because, again, it was a very popular restaurant, right? Like the mayor went there, celebrities would come into town. It was actually a fun place to grow up. So I understand that's different from other kids who had a terrible. I feel bad because a lot of times these Chinese restaurant kids will come up to me afterwards and they'll feel like I hate my life, but I'm like, I actually like growing up in a Chinese restaurant. So. But the Vincent Chin story changed my life because up until then I thought I was going to be a waiter, and then I switched to being a writer, right? The A to the R. Is everybody here familiar with the Vincent Chin case? Yes. Is anybody here not? Because I will explain it if not.
I think it would be good.
Even if there's one person.
Yeah.
Okay, if you don't know, okay. So this is the 80s. They're in the height of the anti-Japanese automobile, era in the country, but particularly Detroit. America's auto industry was falling behind compared to the Japanese. So there was a lot of Japan bashing in Detroit. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He goes to this bar. At some point, these two white auto workers come in. They're overheard saying it's because your mother blanks that we're out of work. They get kicked out, but these guys get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit until they see him sitting outside of a bar, outside of McDonald's. They pick up a bat, they bash his head in, right? And so our families were friends, right? My uncle was his best man. So this was a real close to my family. And, so when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's in the hospital fighting for their life, you're going to check the newspapers, right? So I scrambled to see what they were going to write about it. I checked the news, nothing, right? I checked the next day, nothing. The next day, nothing. The next day, nothing. It took them 12 days before they reported on this horrific, incident. And by that time, he'd spent 4 days in the hospital fighting for his life. They canceled the wedding. Everybody in the Chinese American community kept coming down to our restaurant, asking for any updates and stuff like that, because our restaurant was literally the center of Chinatown. And so it was like really impactful to me, because at the same time, so finally after 12 days, they write one story, which is, admittedly, it was a good story and it was a front page story. But after that, it took another 10 months before they reported on it. Meanwhile, they were writing all these stories about the white auto workers, how difficult their lives were, and the worst part is that the judge, when it came time to sentencing, only fined these guys $3,000. They never served a single day in jail. And the judge's rationale was that you don't put these type of people in jail. And it instantly occurred to me that, what type of people do you put in jails? And it's the simple fact that it's because he's only thinking about these killers. He's not thinking about Vincent. He never thought about the impact of this murder on Vincent's family or even our Asian American community. And so it really taught me the importance of having our stories out there. And so what I did as a 14-year-old was I lugged the typewriter into the dining room and started writing these letters. Do you guys know what typewriters are? Those old big things? And I started writing these letters to the editor saying, hey, why are you guys not covering this? And none of the papers ever printed what I wrote, because I'm 14 and probably not a very good writer. But again, if the judge had thought of us as people, as Americans, as people that's part of the Detroit fabric, I don't think he would have given that sentence. I just can't imagine it, right? And so that's why, for me, I've spent my life really trying to make sure that we hear as many Asian American stories as possible. It's why I went, I joined the high school newspaper staff. Admittedly, please don't look up those stories because I was still right-wing back then, so I don't want those stories showing up. But, and then I went to the University of Michigan, got a creative writing degree, and then I went off to New York and I co-founded this group called the Asian American Artists Workshop. And so that just always has been my mission in life, is like not just me telling my own stories, but as many Asian Americans to tell all of our stories, because that's what it will take to help. I don't want to say defeat racism, because I'm not so Pollyanna to think that we will ever defeat things like that, but I think we can lessen it. I think we can corner it in a way so that people can't act on it and things like that. And I think that's where storytelling comes in, right? And that's why it's so important.
The power of storytelling and advocacy.
Yeah. Yep.
How big of a factor, you talk a little bit about your changing parties. So, I mean, in that context, I mean, we live in a very divisive, whether you're into parties or not, it's out there. So, and you mentioned that your book as being pretty pivotal. When you changed, when you shifted. So,
yeah.
Any other reflections on that?
Well, I mean, so I am one of those people that's very concerned. I'm sure lots of people are. We're concerned about the direction of the country and how we have these little silos where we don't talk to each other, right? We just seem to hate each other. But Chinese restaurants are, I feel like, one of the few places where you can actually go in and see somebody from a different race or socioeconomic background or religion or sexual orientation. And, if we just started from that, like leaning over at the table next to you and just asking that person, what did you order? Starting these very basic conversations, maybe that's what our country needs to do, is just take these baby steps to start healing these fractures that we have. And so the way I pitched it to my agent was like, the book would be like, come for the egg rolls, but stay for the talk on racism. Because we can't avoid these discussions, but I feel like we have to find a way to talk about it in a way that's a little bit, that brings us together, or at least brings about further understanding, rather than some of these other emotions like anger and fear and hate and stuff like that. And so that's what in a small way, that's what I would like my book to do, is like maybe start these conversations, so.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it happen in the corporate sector, where, we're doing all kinds of meetings and around boardrooms, but really, when we go out for happy hour.
Food.
To the taqueria.
I mean, that's the whole premise of the stuff you do, right? Like, food actually breaks the ice, you know what I mean? And maybe that's where we need to start, is like literally having a family meal together, right? Talking to each other, and seeing that we have, hopefully the same goals. I mean, maybe not. Yeah.
Maybe Congress should have more potlucks, maybe less group.
Yeah,
right?
and also being someone who used to be part of that other party and who I feel like maybe that gives me a little bit more insight into some of their thinking and stuff like that. It's like maybe that's part of that healing or that understanding.
And seeing them as people, as you mentioned, that makes a big difference. If you don't see them as being human, then
Yeah, I don't think so black and white. I think this is part of being Buddhist, right? We always look for the gray area stuff, right? Some of the monotheistic religions are very black and white. It's really good versus evil, but I wasn't raised that way. And so for me, like looking at the different parties in this country, obviously I prefer one over the other, but that doesn't mean the other party doesn't have some occasional good ideas. I mean, not as many these days, but but they occasionally still have one or two good ideas, and it's important to listen and find out what those are, right? Because the other party, isn't perfect either. They don't have all the answers, right? And so for me, that's what it's about. It's about having that ability to have these discussions, right?
Yeah, I think we should move the debates all into the restaurant.
Yes. All the presidential debates should be held in a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, I think you argue over the kung pao chicken and squeeze our pork and pork fried rice and tofu buns, right?
Yes, have them do it over food,
Right. Wonderful. Well, I've been given the time check, and I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to solicit some questions from the audience.
We will.
Well.
We thank you so much. We're going to do that. Can we first give them a round of applause? So we do have about 15 minutes for questions.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Yes.
And I want to take a picture too of the audience here, because I always do that. Good. Okay,
If anyone
questions?
has a question, please raise your hand. Anybody?
As you travel around for your book tour, do you see sort of regional differences in people's responses, or is this just sort of this unifying?
Everybody loves the book.
I just was wondering, because regional flavors, I mean, Chinese restaurants even in different cities have different flavors.
There is some regional differences, at least, amongst the Asian Americans who come, it's this weird, like, oh my God, I didn't know there were Asians in the Midwest, or like that you guys had been there that long, right? Like, what were you guys doing there? Yes, so there's that. In terms of the regional differences in general, though, one of the things that I did in writing the book was I really wanted to make sure the book was universal. So I signed up for writing workshops everywhere, like international even, because during COVID you could, right? You just go online. And so I signed up for workshops in Scotland, in Amsterdam, in Phoenix, in Detroit, because I really wanted to see how the book would play. And so there is a difference, right, in terms of the writing. And the perfect example I'll give is talking about the Detroit riots or the Detroit rebellion. That was in my prologue. You know, an older white woman in her 60s, a retired doctor from the Phoenix suburbs, so she's well off. She said that, you know, I can read about race and talk about race, but you can't do it so early, right? Because I immediately shut down, right? But then I had a black reader in Detroit say, no, you have to talk about race on the first page, or I think that you're avoiding the subject. And so as the writer, you've got to reconcile, well, you know, how do you attract both audiences and their expectations about these discussions, right? And so there are regional differences, right? Whether your gender, your sexual orientation, your class, the world that you bring when you pick up the book stays with you as you're reading the pages. It's the filter that you see it. And so inevitably, yeah, I mean, you know, but I try to take into account all these different voices or types of people in writing it. And that's why I did read it, want to join these groups, because inevitably I have cultural biases based off of my thing. And you know, it was really great that people called me out on it and said, oh, this is where it seems like you're picking one side over the other, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
When our Chinese restaurants serve sweet iced tea down here. That's one difference, right? Other questions? Yes.
Curtis, who are your favorite writers? Who are your inspiration?
Oh, I can't say, because I have too many friends. Yeah. What? Amy Tan. No, but my good friend Jeff Yang has a new book coming out called The Golden Screen, so you guys should definitely pick that up. But I have just too many friends. This is why, like, you know, this is what happens when you're a writer. You can't pick one friend over the other.
My book will become your favorite.
Oh yes, and Natalie's is one of them too. Yes, obviously, yes. And any other writer in the audience here who's come to this reading, you're my favorite writer.
I want to ask you, you said the workshop.
Yes.
So you said you were assigned to any workshop in the world.
On Meetup.
So, okay, so they try to help you to critique?
Yes. So what happened? So in creative writing workshops online, what you do is you meet up in a Zoom session, and they vary, right? Sometimes you submit your work in advance, sometimes you read it live, but basically you get feedback from the other aspiring writers who are also working on pieces. And so they'll read it for you and say like, oh, this didn't make sense to me, or I didn't like the way that you did that. Oh, or I like that, you know. So that's what I did. Like I treated it like a job. I was like, you know, every day I had one workshop in a different part of the world, sometimes two.
Workshop you went to?
Oh my God, look, if you look at the credits, I list them all. There's probably like 20 or 30 different workshops. Yeah, because, you know, with workshops, are you hoping to write a book yourself?
Yeah, I published my book.
Yeah, so did you participate in workshops?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
It's because I painted my story. I first started write a statement in my story. It's my biography.
Okay, yeah, so like a memoir.
So there, I write about I have for editor, give me feedback.
You paid somebody?
Yeah,
Yeah.
editor, yeah, for publisher editor, give me feedback and
Yeah.
just give me idea and because of my personal story.
Yeah.
So right now all story is about behind my personal story behind is the Chinese history.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that. But I feel interesting because about we are similar but different from
Yeah, no, I mean, nobody has the same life.
China, you know.
Huh?
Yeah, my life in China for 45 years.
Oh.
So that's different.
Oh, are you a communist? Do you like the communists? I don't know. She said we're different.
In my story,
What?
behind this Chinese history is about my father.
Oh, okay.
My father was the person, I was 3 years old.
Mm.
And because he is a free speak.
Mm.
Okay. So all, I painted the whole story is about how the Chinese communists, the dictator, how to destroy all my family's life, including mine.
Mm.
So my life was so difficult. I worked factory when I was 13.
Mm.
I come to the United States, I was 45 years old.
Mm.
I got my green card in China as an individual ability, but it's so difficult.
Mhm.
So it's a tragedy. My life was tragedy. It's inside of me.
Mhm.
But you cannot paint the story in China. So I come in United States. Finally, I was successful in China. Was very successful. But I want
Writing?
Yeah, in China I was.
But you're writing other stuff.
So, but
Okay.
I come to America because I want to change my story because just like you, you want your family to know your family story, right? So first, I want to paint your family.
I want people to know my mom's story,
Yeah.
more so for me, yeah.
For me, I want my kids to know the Chinese history. Why my father was hanging himself, killing himself. Why I worked the factory. Why we suffering. So first, like you, I painted my story, but I cannot publish in China. So that's I come in the States. I want to give you. I have my book. I would like to give you, but different. So but I'm so interested to know your story.
It takes a while to publish, though. I mean, you can self-publish, which is what I think sounds like you said you did.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have. I worked for my book for more than 10 years.
Yeah. Well, it took me 10 years to write the book, too. It takes a long time to write a book.
Yeah, I got a grant. I'm a professor.
Yeah.
I retired.
Okay.
I come to America, finished two master's degrees,
Okay.
and then began the professor while I retired. So I moved to management.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just just like you say that everybody they need to write a book to encourage people that understand about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I really like you because I said to my husband, we need to come here because I never see Chinese person who can say I'm gay.
Yeah.
So I'm so really happy.
Okay, I'm going to say it just for you again. I'm gay. Does that make you happy? What?
Chinese afraid.
Okay.
So right, so many Chinese, so this is why
Yeah.
we are, so.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your comment, and thank you for writing your book and sharing the story. And hopefully you can get it out there. I mean, a lot of it is also not just the writing of the book, but also the marketing and the promotion, which any writer will tell you is half the battle. You know what I mean?
She's a good model. Yeah, I'm painting, I have a studio gallery. I just told her I have events in my gallery.
Yeah, you'll be up here next.
Okay.
So I know that we're winding up, and I know that there are folks who want their book signed. We have a raffle.